Welcome back. Let's now start working on project number 2 of this section. And in this small project, we're going to build our first UI component. And that is this modal window that we can see here by opening or by clicking actually on one of these buttons. So I'm sure you've seen this kind of component all over the place when visiting web pages. And so it's simply this window here basically and this overlay which gets overlaid over the rest of the page, right? So no matter which of these 3 buttons we click, it will always open this modal window. And to close this window, as you already saw, we can either click this button here or we can click outside of the window. So basically on this overlay. And again, I'm sure that you have seen this functionality when visiting other web pages. So that worked as well. And finally, we can also close this window by hitting the escape key on our keyboard like this. Okay? And this is actually very simple and very easy to build. Probably way easier than it looks like. But it will still be very useful to learn how to work with classes. And that's super important because manipulating classes is actually the main way in which we manipulate web pages. Okay? Now here on the left side, I still have the code from the previous project open, and that's because I wanted to show you how to close the live server. So let's go back to the terminal. And so as we hit new terminal, it actually creates a new terminal. So if we want to go to the first one that was already running, we need to go here to this menu here, and then number 1, which is this note. So to change this now, we hit Control-C, and that's even Control on a Mac. So it's not Command-C, it is Control-C. And I guess on Windows, it's going to be the same. But if it's not, you can just click this trash can here, and that will also then kill the terminal. So as I hit Control-C, the process has finished, and so the live server is no longer running. So if I come here to this URL, so this localhost URL plus the current port, which is 8080. So if I now reload this page, it will be gone. So there's no connection possible anymore because I just killed the live server. Okay, just wanted to let you know about that. Okay, anyway, let's now close up this folder here and open a new one. And as always, I already have here the starter files for this modal project. So let's open up a new VS Code window. And let's open up this one. And once again, I have the prettier configuration here. And then the index, the JavaScript, and the CSS styles. Okay, open up script. And actually, we can open all of them because we will want to take a look at the 3 files. Okay, and as before, we still are using strict mode. And so I already included that here at the top of the file. Okay, and now let's get to work actually. Now this time, we will actually start by selecting everything that we're going to need for this project. So that's usually what we do when we build a project like this. So we select the elements that we need, and then we store the selections into variables. Okay, and then we can use them over and over again. So that's way better than selecting the same elements over and over again, like we did in the last project. All right, but in the last project, I didn't want to overcomplicate stuff and do too many things at the same time. And so I just selected all the stuff multiple times. But again, this time, we will have all the necessary selections, so all the necessary elements that we're going to need, nicely organized here at the top of the file, each in its own variable. So let's take a look at the HTML. And so here we see the 3 buttons. So that's these 3 buttons. And then we actually already have the modal window here in the code. So this div element here. So it's already in the code, it's simply hidden. That's why it has this hidden class. And now in the CSS, let's come here to the bottom of the file. And so the hidden class simply sets the display to none. And so that's why the window is currently hidden. All right. So again, as I said in the beginning, in this project, we will work with classes. And so this hidden class is the main class that we will be concerned with. So anyway, this means that we will not basically create the HTML for the modal window using JavaScript. It is already there. All we will do is to show it and to hide it according to the clicks on the buttons. So that's the modal, and that is the overlay. So that's basically this dark part here, which hides the background. And then here we have this button to close the modal window. And so that's all that we need. So again, we need to select the modal, the overlay, the close modal button, and then of course the show modal buttons. Okay, so let's do that. So const modal is document.querySelector, and then just like before, we are looking for the element with the class of modal. Okay, so just like we did in the first project, we select an element using the selector, but then this time we actually store the result of the selection, so the selected element, in this variable. Okay, so that's the element with the class modal. Now we want overlay and then close modal. So overlay, and of course we could give these any names that we wanted, but these names make it easy to understand what they are. So I'm giving them the same names as the class names, basically. So that's the overlay. And now the close modal button. And let's call this one actually a button. So btn, which stands for button, and then close modal document.querySelector. And then this class is close-modal. Okay. And now finally, we also want the show modal buttons. Now, there are actually 3 elements with this class name. So let me show you what happens when we simply select in the same way that we did before. So let's say button, or buttons actually, because we want multiple, open modal, and then document.querySelector open modal. Okay, and so watch what happens when we log this to the console. So buttons, open modal, that's the one. And now to actually see this, we need to again start the live server. So new terminal, clear this console, and then all I have to do is to type live server, hit enter, and here we go. So this is our modal window now, and this one we can now close. And actually it has the exact same URL. So it's always this 127.0.0.1, which stands for localhost at port 8080. So if we reloaded this one, it would show us the same thing. Okay, so we can just close one of them, and so it looks exactly the same as the demo, but of course nothing is going to happen yet, because as you know, we have no event handlers on any of these buttons yet. But now I wanted to take a look at the console, and yeah, and now here we get null for some reason. So it means that it could not select anything here for this selector. And so let's take a look. Yeah, actually it is show modal and not open. Okay, so let's fix that. So it's not open, it is show. And maybe you have spotted that if you took a more careful look at the HTML than I did. Now anyway, now we see this button here selected. However, as you can see, it is only the first one. Okay. And so now we see the limitation of our query selector method here for the first time. So whenever we use query selector with a selector which actually matches multiple elements, only the first one will get selected. And so here we need another one, but it's pretty similar. It's called query selector all. So that's a pretty obvious name, but it's going to do the job. So as I save now you see that we get something called a node list here. So let me open that. And now as I hover, you see that these are actually all of our 3 buttons. Okay. So this node list here is a little bit like an array. It's not exactly like an array, but here for now, it works as though it was an array. Okay. And so now if we want to do something, for example, to all of these buttons, then we can simply loop through this node list and do something with them. So let's actually quickly do that. So we will now again use the for loop. And now I hope there's no need to explain anymore how this one works. So I should stay below the length of this node list, which again, for our purposes here, works just like an array. Buttons open modal dot length, and then at the end of each iteration, increase the counter. And so in each iteration, what we want to do is simply to log to the console the text content of each of them. All right. So what we want to do is buttons open modal, and then we take the current one. And so this here is now an element. Okay. It's one of these elements. And well, now it already logged because it saved the file. But yeah, anyway, each of these here is one element. And so now on each of them, we can simply use the text content property just like we did in the last project. All right. So let's save it again. And indeed, now we get the 3 text contents for all the 3 buttons. And here you might have noticed that I didn't even use the curly braces to define a block. And that's because, just like in an if-else statement, if there's only one line of code that I want to execute, I actually don't have to create this block. Okay, I can just write one line after the for loop, and then that's the one that will be iterated over and over again. Okay, so again, this works just fine. And now I have a way of selecting multiple elements with the same class. And then with the for loop, I can do something for each of them. In this case, all we did was to log their text content to the console, but in the future, we will then be able to do real stuff using this technique. Okay, and that's it for this video. In the next one, we will actually already make this modal window work. So don't wait, and let's move on to the next video right away. Let's now actually learn how to manipulate classes with JavaScript. But the first thing that we have to do is to actually react to a click on each of these buttons here. So right now, of course, nothing happens. And so now we need to attach an event handler to each of these 3 buttons. Now we finished the last video by learning how we can do something for all of these 3 buttons at the same time, right? So for that, we used a for loop, which loops over this node list, which is basically an array holding all of the buttons. And so this buttons open modal at position number I is the current button element in each iteration. And then from there, we simply read the text content property just like on any other element. All right. But now let's take it one step further. And instead of simply reading the text content property, we will call the addEventListener method, just like we learned in the last project. Okay, so remember, in order to respond to a click event, we will attach an event handler function to the element. And event handler and event listener are pretty much the same thing. So that's why this method is called event listener. So let's say add event listener, and then the name of the event. And that is once more the click event. And then The second argument is the function which will contain the code that should be executed once the button is clicked. So that will be an anonymous function, remember, so a function without a name. And it is, of course, also a function expression, because it's simply this value here. So this function value. So just as I explained multiple times already, but it's important to keep remembering this stuff as we go here through this section. And to start, let's simply log to the console the text content of the button that was clicked. Now here there's actually a mistake, because of course we don't want to log to the console this event listener, right? That doesn't make any sense. Instead, we now want to log something to the console right here inside this handler function. So that's just CL again. And then let's just say button clicked. Give it a save. And now each of these three buttons here has their own event handler function attached to it. So button clicked. And when we clicked on this one, then the same should appear. And indeed, now we have two. So that's what this 2 means. And as we click here, we get another one and another and another. And so, yeah, this worked. So we attached this function here now to all of the 3 buttons. And again, because we did it here in the loop while we were looping over this node list, which contains all of these 3 buttons. Okay, but now, of course, this is not the only thing that we want to do. Instead, we want to display the modal. And remember that this modal is already in the HTML. It is hidden right now because it has the hidden class. If it did not have this hidden class, it would be visible. Let me actually show that. So I delete it, and if I save it now, then you see here is the modal. Right? Here it is. And that's because the hidden class is now gone. And so basically this is exactly what we will do using JavaScript. So removing this class. Okay? So what we want to do is to take the modal, so this element that we selected here previously, right? So we selected it and then stored it into this variable. And so now we take that selected element, and on there we can read the class list property. So that's class list. And then this class list property itself has a couple of methods. And the one we're going to use now is remove. And as I just explained, the class that we're going to remove is the class called hidden. Okay? And we can actually also remove multiple classes. For that, we just have to pass them in with commas like this. So here we then can specify more classes. Just keep in mind that we do not use the dot here. So not like this, okay? And I'm telling you that because I used to do that mistake myself and I remember that. And so yeah, I want you to avoid it. So the dot is only for the selector. But here we are not anymore selecting anything. We're just passing in the name of the class. And so all we need is the string with that name. Okay? Now, besides removing classes, we can also add classes, and we can even check if an element contains a certain class or not. And we will use all of them in this video and the next one. Okay. And this should actually already do the trick. So when I save this now, and let's click here, and it worked. Great. So the hidden class is now gone, and I can show that to you here using the inspect. And then we need to give it some more space back. And then you see here the modal class that used to be here is no longer there. Now we can of course not close it because that functionality is not yet there, but at least now it is open. Now we also have the overlay, which is this one, which also has the hidden class. And so in order to show that overlay, we need to remove the hidden class from this element as well. So that's easy enough. It's just the same thing again. So overlay dot class list dot remove, and then again hidden. All right. And yeah, beautiful. That's really nice. So using classes like this is a really great and handy way of manipulating web pages. And in practice, adding and removing classes like we just did here is the main way in which we change styles on websites. That's because a class basically aggregates many styles in just one class. Now in this case, actually the hidden class only contains this one style here. So this would have been the same as specifying the display style directly in JavaScript. So like we learned in the last project. So we could have done also modal.style.display and then set it to block, I guess, or what was it? Yeah, nothing. So basically, display none means that it's not visible, and if we want it to be visible, we would set it to display block. Okay, so this would do the exact same thing, but you can see that it's a bit more of a pain, because then we would have to memorize what exactly we have to write here. So the exact property name and the exact value. And this is only for one style. Imagine that the hidden class actually had 10 properties. Then we would have to write all of these properties here manually and change all their values. So that's a lot of work and it's not fun. And so instead, we can basically aggregate all of these properties in one class that we then define here in CSS. And then in JavaScript, we simply add and remove these classes as we need or don't need these styles. So usually when you need to manipulate styles on a page, then always just export the styles into a class and then use the class just like we did here. All right. Now what we just did here is for showing the modal window, but now let's also add the ability of then hiding it by clicking that button. So this button here. Okay. So right now, as I said, it's not possible to close the window unless we reload the whole page. So let's take this button here that we already selected and simply add an event listener to that one as well. So button close modal dot add event listener, and again waiting for the click event, and then let's specify our function here again. Okay. So again, we are just defining the function here. We are not calling it itself. It is the JavaScript engine who will call this function as soon as the click event happens on exactly this element. All right. Anyway, here we now want to do the opposite. So basically, we want to add the class back on. So modal.classList.add this time. And so we add the hidden class back on, which will then hide the modal. And the same actually for the overlay. So let's just duplicate this line here and change this to overlay. And yeah, this should already work. So that already worked before. And now let's check it. And yes, it does. And it should work for all the 3 buttons, of course. And yeah, it does. Great. So again, this is a very common thing to do. We change the appearance of websites and of elements like this all the time using this class technique. Next up, usually when we click outside of a modal, then the modal window also closes. So that's pretty common, right? So what I mean is clicking this area here outside should also close this window. So basically, we want this code here to also be executed when we click on the modal, or actually on the overlay. So let's do that. So overlay.add event listener click. And now what should I do? Well, just to make it work, I can copy this code here, but you already know that this is not a good idea, probably. But let's just, for now, see if it works. So if we click outside, so this is the overlay. So as we click it now, then indeed, the modal and the overlay are both hidden again. Great. So this works now. But again, we do not want this same code here in these two places. We want actually the exact same function to be executed no matter if we click the close button or if we click the overlay. So how should we do that? Well, we can simply export this function into a more real named function. So let me cut the code from here, and then I will create a function called close modal. So const close modal equals this function value. Okay, and so now this variable here is what holds the function value. And so what I can do now is to here specify that close modal function. And that's it. That's the function right here. So this here, what we have here, is exactly the same as this. And again, notice that we are not calling the function. We are not doing this, right? This would not work at all because it would immediately call the function as soon as JavaScript executes this line. But that's not what we want to happen. We want the close modal function to be executed only as soon as the click event happens on the close modal button. All right? And now here we can just do the same thing. So again, close modal. And that's it. That's so much better than what we had before. Not only did we make our code more dry, but we also made it more readable, more expressive, and more declarative. So right now, when we read this code here, it's a lot easier to understand. So we just read button close modal at the event listener of close the modal. Okay, that makes sense. So just by looking at this line, we see that when this element is clicked, then we want to close the modal. The same, when the overlay is clicked, we want to close the modal. All right, and so we know exactly what's going to happen when we read this code. And so for that advantage alone, let's do the same thing here with this function. So the one that opens the modal. So let me grab this one, just put them up here. You can also get rid of this console.log. And so let's put the two functions here together. So open modal. And now this function will be just this, right? So I'll just cut it again and paste it here. And so now we assigned this function here to this open modal variable. So once more, a nice function expression. And now we just take that and put it here. Open modal. And of course, again, we don't call it. We simply declare or we define it here and tell JavaScript, hey, whenever a click happens on one of these buttons, then please call this function that we just specify here. All right. And so this is our code and it's a lot better. And so actually we just did some refactoring here and so restructuring our code without changing the functionality. And so that means that our code should still work the same. And indeed it does. We can open and close in two ways, and we can open it on all of the three buttons. Beautiful. That's really, really great. So to recap, if you want to use the same function in multiple event listeners, then you need to specify that function as a separate function, like this one here, and then you can pass that function as an argument to multiple add-event-listener methods. So just like we did it here, right? So that's one of the takeaways of this video. And the other one is that we really, in practice, use the functionality of adding and removing classes all the time in order to change the appearance of elements on our page. And that's because classes allow us to basically aggregate multiple CSS properties in just one, like a container. So each class functions a bit like a container with a lot of properties in it. And then here, by adding and removing them, we basically can activate and deactivate certain styles all at the same time. Okay, so keep that in mind, and even better, actually write notes maybe with what I'm saying, because this is really important stuff. So working with classes is something that we do all the time. And there is a third thing that we do with classes, which is to check if a class is actually present on a certain element. And so that's going to be the topic of the next video, along with learning how to actually deal with a key press event. So that's yet another really exciting video. So let's now check that out. Let's now learn how to handle key press events. So right now we can already close the modal by clicking the close button and by clicking outside of the modal. But usually there is also a third way, and that's by hitting the escape key on the keyboard, right? And so this is actually a great use case to learn how to respond to keyboard events. So in order to listen for keyboard events, we still need to use add event listener, because the key press event is simply just another type of event. Now, keyboard events are so-called global events because they do not happen on one specific element. And for global events like keyboard events, we usually listen on the whole document. So let's close this terminal here. And now let's write document. So that's the same document that we use for query selector. And so basically it's a big object which contains a bunch of methods for all kinds of stuff. And that includes the add event listener method. So by using add event listener here on the document, we are basically listening for events everywhere. So no matter where they happen on the page, they will always trigger the event handler that we're going to specify here. All right. Now here about the name of the event itself, there are actually three types of events for the keyboard. There is the key down, the key press, or the key up. Key up, which is, so it's this one. This one only happens when we lift our finger off the keyboard, basically, or off the key. Key press is fired continuously as we keep our finger on a certain key. And key down is fired as soon as we just press down the key. And so usually that is the one that we use. Okay, so the name of this event is just key down, and this event will happen as soon as we hit any key on the keyboard. Okay, and then just like before, we specify a function here. And this time let's specify it here directly, so without creating a separate function. So function, and then the usual way, just like we have been doing. Now, as I just mentioned here, so this function here will actually be executed for any key press that happens. So let me prove that to you. And actually it will be hard to prove because you cannot see what key I'm pressing. But anyway, a key was pressed. And so now as I go to the console and just press any key, you see a key was pressed. And it doesn't matter which one. So Q, 3, P, enter, ask, any key just renders here this same message. However, we only want to close the pop-up when the escape key was pressed. Okay, so that key in the top left corner which says ask, right? So how will we know which key was actually pressed if this event here happens for all the keys? Well, the information about which key was pressed will be stored in the event that is going to occur as soon as any key is pressed. So remember, as I hit any key here on the keyboard, a key down event is generated, and our listener function here, so our handler function, is waiting for that event to happen. And anytime that an event like this occurs, JavaScript does in fact generate an object. And that object contains all the information about the event itself, and we can then actually access that object in the event handler function. All right? So again, when an event happened, we can have access to information about that event in the event handler function, just like this one. Now, up until this point, we have never looked at that event. We only just listened for it and then reacted to it, right? But this time, we actually need to look at the event object in order to figure out which key was pressed. And how can we do that? Well, what we need to do is to give this function here a parameter. and let's call it E, which stands for event. So we could also call it event, or we could call it X or Q, I, so it doesn't matter. But I like to call it E, which stands again for event. Okay? So then, as the event occurs, JavaScript will call this function with the event object as an argument. And once more, this works because we do not call this function here ourselves, right? We do not call the function, we only define it here. So we say, hey JavaScript, call this function when a key down event happens. And when you do so, please pass in the event object as an argument. Okay? And we will learn about the mechanics of this a bit better later. But it's probably still a good idea to already take notes of this stuff that I'm explaining. Anyway, now that you know why this function has access to an event, so to this E here, let's now actually take a look at it. So simply logging it to the console for now, and we can actually get rid of this one here. And now I will hit the Enter key. And so you see, now we get this event, and it's called a keyword event. It is just an object that is generated by JavaScript. So you see that here in the console, it actually looks like the objects that we generated ourselves previously. So with a key here and then a value. So a property and a value. And what matters here is basically the key, which, as I said, was enter. So I hit the enter key, and then this event was generated with the key property set to enter. So that's great information, because now when I hit the escape key, then you see that the key was now escape. Or I can of course hit any key. So this was the space key. So you see here, we have a space, or the Q, or Z, or Control, or Shift. And so whatever key you press, we now get this information about the event itself. And in this case, since it was a keyboard event, we get information about which key was pressed. So as you see, the information about the key, I was always getting it from this key property. So let's just log e.key, because remember, we used dot and then the property name to read any property from an object. And so escape is now the key that I pressed, or enter, or shift, and so on and so forth. Great! And now that I know which key was actually pressed, I can use that information to actually close the modal whenever the escape key is pressed. So we can simply do if e.key triple equal escape. And then again, let's just log to the console to see if it works. Esc was pressed. And so now I can hit any key and nothing happens. Or actually, some stuff happens because we're still logging here the e.key, but the string that I just wrote here does not appear unless I hit the escape key. So now you see esc was pressed. All right. So that's of course not what we want, but instead we want to close the modal. However, I only want to close the modal when the modal is actually visible, right? And how do we know if the modal is currently visible? Well, if the modal contains the class hidden, it means that it's not visible. And so basically, when it does not contain the class hidden, it means that it's visible, and then that's the condition in which we want to close it. All right? And so we talked in the last lecture about adding and removing classes, but as I mentioned back then, we can also check if an element already has a certain class. And so now that becomes really handy, because now I can do this. So if the escape key is pressed, then we can now check if the modal contains the hidden class. So another if. So if modal and again dot class list and then dot contains, and then again the class name. So that's hidden in this case. So if the modal.className contains the hidden class, it means that the modal is currently hidden. And so in this condition, we actually don't want to do anything. We only want to close the modal if it does not contain the hidden class, right? And so here we can once more invert that Boolean value. All right, so this not here is very important, as you probably start to see. So let's read this again. If the modal does not contain the hidden class, then close the modal. And so, how do we close the modal? Well, we can simply call this close modal function, right? So let's do that. Close modal. And here we do actually need to call this function, okay? Because when this function here is executing, so this one here, as it then reaches this line, of course, something needs to happen. And what needs to happen is basically this code. So we could just copy this code down here, but that's of course not what we want. Instead, we can simply use this function here again, and using means here to call it. So to execute the code that is in here, so this. So let's test this now, and then we can improve the code even a little bit. So we open it. Now I'm going to press just any key, let's say enter. So you see enter. And now as I hit the escape key, watch what happens. Yes, indeed, the modal is gone. Great. Let's see where this button clicked here comes from in line 9. Now that's of course because of this console.log. And let's get rid of this. Okay, let's try it again. Open it on this button. I hit any other key, nothing happens. I hit escape and it's gone. Great. Now let's read this code here a little bit. So basically this means if the pressed key is escape and if the modal does not contain the hidden class, then execute this function to close the modal. Now notice how I just said if this and then if this. And so what I mean is that we can actually aggregate these two if statements together. And so this is the same as having just, and I'm cutting it here, so it's the same as having just this. Now we can get rid of this stuff here, and that's it. And so now it reads the exact same way as before. If the pressed key is escape, and if the modal does not contain the class of hidden, then close the modal. So give it another try, just to make sure. And yes, that works perfect. Beautiful. And with this, our modal is actually feature complete. It works exactly as our demo here. And so with this, we finished this very small second project. So once again, I hope you liked this one, and I hope you can start to see the power of DOM manipulation so that in the future you will be able to build anything you can imagine just with JavaScript. Now that is of course still a long way to go, but that's also why we have the next project, which is going to be a really nice project to basically train and reinforce most of the things that we already did in this project and the previous one. So the next project is going to be more like a practice project, but I still believe it's very important to do that project in case you have the time. And believe me, it's by far the most exciting thing we have done yet in this course. So I hope to see you there soon after you take a well-deserved break.